There's three things that we want to learn. The first one is how Vietnam got to be such a high-performing country in terms of education, looking at the time period from about 1990 to 2015. As people may know, Vietnam did very well on these PISA sort of evaluations that were done in 65 countries in the year 2012. And since then, there's been big interest in do that. So we have got data from many different sources going back to the early 1990s and up to 2015 that we can use to try to understand why Vietnam seems to be performing so well. In fact, the first thing we're going to check is whether it really is such a good performer, because if you ask anyone in Vietnam about the PISA scores, they say they don't believe it, that they're that good. But we have other evidence that seems to work, that show that it is really pretty good. The second thing we're going to look at is that Vietnam has actually adopted a program that was started in Colombia in the 1970s called Escuela Nueva, which is designed to get kids to sort of think creatively and to sort of organize themselves to learn and develop critical thinking skills. So Vietnam has adopted that in selected schools, actually about 10% of primary schools in 2014. And so we're going to evaluate how effective that is. Actually, the World Bank is already doing an evaluation for 2 years, but we're going to extend it for 5 more years to follow these kids as they get older, but also to look at its adoption in lower secondary schools. Okay? And then the third thing is there's a planned curriculum reform in Vietnam in 2018. The details of this haven't been worked out yet, so we don't know exactly what it's going to be. But again, there's the idea in Vietnam that the curriculum is out of date. The kids maybe are good at doing math problems and reading, but when they get jobs, the employers complain that they don't have the right skills and things like this. So this big curriculum reform, and we're going to evaluate what's the effect of that on various kinds of skills, both what you might call cognitive skills and also what people call non-cognitive skills or socio-emotional skills.
So in Pakistan, what has happened is that now, instead of thinking about like a single school in a village and thinking about kind of this enrollment issue, there has been a massive change in the educational landscape. There are multiplicity of providers, education regulation has become more complicated, there are intermediaries, parents have higher aspirations, there is devolution of power in terms of constitutional mandates on government. So basically now it looks like that the right way to think about it is not the classical way of thinking about how to augment inputs into the education system, but really now thinking of a proper system-wide approach. And that's what we try to do, is to think about this ecosystem and looking at these frictions that may possibly exist between these different players. Frictions might be things like information between gaps between parents and schools that might not allow schools to be fully rewarded for success, financial gaps that might not allow schools to invest, support in various kind of technical and practice issues in terms of teaching. All of those we want to address, and I think RISE allows us to really look at these things at the same time, and essentially what we can then do is bring them together using a variety of methodologies, longitudinal studies, looking at randomized controlled trials, adaptive research and policy design, and also some qualitative ethnographic fieldwork.
So we're trying to work with different governments in various states, so in Madhya Pradesh, in Delhi, potentially in a couple of other states, and trying to evaluate at scale reforms that governments with large electoral mandates which are interested in school reform are trying to bring in at scale, and all geared towards improving pedagogy, improving governance, and eventually improving student outcomes. So we want to see how far they can get along there and what were the channels through which something like this happened or didn't.
We are evaluating big results now for education in Tanzania, and it's a very big, ambitious systems-wide reform focusing explicitly on improving learning outcomes in the country. And so there are two big questions we want to answer. The one thing is, what happens when the whole education system reorientates itself towards outputs rather than inputs and places pressure on schools to improve learning? How does this change the accountability relationships within the country as a whole, and how does could that eventually improve learning outcomes? Secondary, we want to know more about the political economy, the factors that led to the reform itself, and what kind of sort of coalitions were required to implement and sustain the reform.